We will have one central round of comments in which each speaker will have about 10 minutes to address two issues. One, how do you see the concepts of urban peace and urban peace building? And the second one, how do the concept of urban conflict and peace in times of COVID-19, and how COVID-19 crisis affect the relationship between rival groups in cities. After this round, we will open up for Q&A from the audience. And in this final part of the discussion, we would be glad to hear from the discussants recommendations or thoughts regarding future peace settlements and arrangements in cities. The cities they know, the cities they would like to know, the cities they have thoughts about, etc. So I'm gonna start by introducing the first speaker, Scott Bollens, who's a professor of urban planning and public policy at the University of California, Irvine, where he holds the Warmington Chair in Peace and International Cooperation. He studies the role of urbanism in cities and countries challenged by nationalistic ethnic conflict and political transformations. Professor Bollens has interviewed over 360 urban and community leaders in 9 politically polarized cities over the past 25 years. His 6th book on this subject is Bordered Cities and Divided Societies, Humanistic Essays of Conflict, Violence, and Healing, was published last year by Routledge. And his most recent book is a dystopian futurist novel, Restart, Stories of the Ceren Age, that was published, I guess, 4 months ago. Congratulations, at Atmosphere Press. So Scott, you have 10 minutes, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you for all the organizers of this conference. I have some good friends that I've known for a number of years on this panel, so good to see you all, and people whose writing I highly respect. Urban peace building, what is urban peace building? I look at it this way. I like to contrast it with state-centric peace, national peace agreements. What is different between national peace agreements and urban peace building? State-centric peace agreements are absolutely essential. They allocate political power. They're highly symbolic. You know, the diplomats or negotiators shaking hands with a lot of PR and media, highly symbolic events. And they are important in lessening the role of militias in the streets if militias were active during the conflict. However, national peace agreements are necessarily ambiguous. They have to be ambiguous on the hard issues because you have antagonistic sides trying to come together to form a national peace. And if you get too specific in national peace agreements, one side is going to pull away from the negotiations. So there's an intentional ambiguity, usually in national peace agreements. And this is related to urban peace building because among the ambiguity of national peace agreements is that they are typically silent or say very minimally on urban implementation. What does a national peace agreement mean for people on the streets of cities? They do this for a reason. Mostly negotiators are not expert at all in thinking about cities and the micro scale management that needs to be done to improve conditions in a contested city. So national negotiators, politicians, high politicians stay away from it and are silent. If they say anything about urban peace building, they usually use abstract terms, such as in Northern Ireland, the abstract term of shared space, which sounds great. And it's one of those ambiguous concepts. It sounds great as a concept, but implementing it actually in a contested city can be very difficult. And a concept such as that can be used politically by both of the antagonistic sides in ways to further their own interests. So This is why the importance of urban peace building, because national peace agreements to the average person on the street in a war-torn, conflict-torn city, an abstract national peace agreement is good, but it doesn't really affect their lives directly. And national peace agreements are not easily transferable to urban spaces. So people walking around neighborhoods and markets and other places of intergroup interaction, there are emotional and physical scars of the urban conflict period. There are local places where a relative has been killed during the conflict years. So the national peace is good. It stops the act of fighting, hopefully, but it doesn't typically address the hearts and souls of people living in cities. And this is where urban peace building becomes so important. One example of the disjunction between national and urban peace is, I can draw from Belfast, Northern Ireland, the continuance of the peace walls that divide Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods, the continuation of those. As a matter of fact, the increase in those walls since peace shows the disjunction between a national peace agreement and the realities on the ground. And the very legitimate question, can you have an urban peace with walls? That's the question being faced in Belfast these days. The national agreements in Northern Ireland and Lebanon and Israel-Palestine, and I'll draw back all the way back to Oslo agreement in that case, it shows the difficulty between a national and urban peace. In Northern Ireland, for instance, how does one implement the Good Friday Agreement in a case where you have in Belfast walls, you have strict territoriality in the neighborhoods? The city is not normalized at all. It's kind of staying in a state of suspended animation. It's good that there's little political violence, and that's a huge thing, right? But the city is in a suspended status in many ways. It's certainly not war in Belfast, but is this really a livable peace that is sustainable and will grow over time? Only through more active interventions at the urban level can you really make a national peace agreement more alive, more directly touching the hearts and souls of people living in cities. In Lebanon, you have the power sharing agreement, historic power sharing agreement, which kind of locks in place the allocation across three major sectarian groups. And that kind of keeps Lebanon together, although barely, right? But in urban space, one group fundamentally controls urban space. And that group can at any time, if they feel aggrieved, take over the streets of Beirut and the southern suburbs. So there's that disjunction again between the lived reality and this national arrangement, this national agreement. Going way back to Oslo and Israel-Palestine, the national agreement was partial and anticipated a step-by-step process. However, that left the process entirely vulnerable to extremist actions on the ground. So here's a case where the national agreement stepped aside. It wanted phases, but that in retrospect, it's very easy to see how that was easily disrupted by urban conflict. In none of these three cases here, this urban life approximate what we would call peace, quote unquote peace, a peace that would increase on the ground tolerance between groups. Okay. Now, 3 minutes left to cover COVID. Oh my goodness.
Well, you can have 4.
4 minutes, all right, thank you. The pandemic reveals urban realities and inequalities that have long existed in cities. In the United States, the inequality in work conditions and the work conditions that expose the lower classes to the disease exposure much more than the middle and upper classes that are able to hang out in remote settings and stay somewhat immune to the pandemic. These frontline workers, disproportionately non-white and at lower income levels. This inequality in work conditions has always been there, but the pandemic reveals in stark ways that this inequality and the inequality of opportunity. Naomi Klein wrote a book many years ago that says that during crisis conditions, and I'll say here during what seems like the suspended animation period of the pandemic, that during these conditions, those that have political and economic power will intervene in ways to increase and consolidate their hold on society. And I think that's what's going on right now. This is not 2 years of just nothing happening in societal dynamics. This is the increased implantation of information technology and biomedical technology onto cities' residents. Public health has opened the door to further monitoring and tracking of citizens. And this is going to legitimize future interventions in the future in, let's call it, digital surveillance, as city residents become more used to just being tracked. Now it's being tracked for public health reasons. In the future, likely tracked for all sorts of other, maybe less benign reasons. So digital surveillance to control restless populations and continued erosion of privacy is probably what is going on in many cities and countries while we go through the pandemic. In the United States, it's not just it's just not COVID, of course. We've had periods of civil unrest over police brutality and extreme political polarization. It's a potent and volatile combination of major societal factors. I've taught a class on international divided cities for years, and students always used to ask me, are US cities approaching polarization that we see in Lebanon, in Israel, Palestine, in Cyprus, et cetera, in Nicosia? And I always used to say, no, we're still good. But increasingly, over the last 2 years, I'm saying we're approaching more and more the conditions of polarization in many other contested cities throughout the world. The US is on the road to an extreme us versus them dynamic, which characterizes polarized societies. We're on a downward spiral toward intractable division between, I'll use labels here, between a multicultural left and a far right wing composed, including a group of white nationalists. And in that, we have the assault, we have situations that really approximate Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and all the other polarized places in the world. Each side is assaulting the identity of the other side. Each side views the other side as a threat, as dead wrong, as warped in their vision of reality. And the cities that I've studied over the last 25 years, that characterizes that us versus them dynamic. And now we have it in the United States. Growing hopelessness on the part of young people associated with the civil unrest and the question of police brutality. We have the battle over symbols and images. A white nationalist holding an AR-15 semi-automatic gun on the top steps of a state capitol is a potent symbol of contesting sovereignty of the United States government. We have extremists that are dominating people's attention and media, and facilitated, of course, by the social media, which thrives off of hatred and conflict. And we have the use of urban space in conflict and territoriality, riots in the streets, occupation of buildings, gaining territory, at least temporarily, as a way to assert political claims. The government system in the United States is still intact, barely, but we are approaching a situation where we have 30% of the people of the United States do not believe that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. That is the contested sovereignty that I see a lot in polarized societies that I've studied over the last decades. We don't yet have a group-based strategy of recurring political violence. So we don't have militias that regularly engage in political violence. We have it more episodic at this point. That chronic condition of political violence may be in the future. Let's hope not. And I'll end with this. The US is probably moving toward a situation where either approximating Israel-Palestine, where there is no resolution of basic political issues, and yet one side is firmly in control, or we're approaching a situation such as Lebanon, where we have a terribly fragmented society and a dysfunctional government. In our fragmented society in the US, it would be between more the blue and the red, blue Democratic, red conservative, metropolitan areas being blue, more Democratic, where red areas would be the smaller towns and rural areas of the United States. So those are some of my ideas about COVID. Obviously, seems like an incredibly abnormal period in terms of public health, but I would suggest that there are dynamics going on where the powerful, economically powerful, are doing well and taking advantage of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your remarks. Next is Ceren Bogatt. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
It's Ceren, actually, but fine.
Ceren, okay.
Yeah.
Ceren. She was born in Famagusta. She's a community resilience activist and architect. She's an associate professor at the Eastern Mediterranean University, Department of Architecture. She has a master and a PhD in environmental psychology under the scope of architecture major. She conducted postdoctoral research on architectural design pedagogy. She received the European Commission research in 2010 and Fulbright Visiting Scholar in 2018 grants. Her specific areas of expertise include sense of place, place attachment, meaning in architecture, eco-city, eco-architecture, and urban peace building studies. Ceren, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for the kind introductions, and I respectfully greet all the peace scholars around the world who are here today. I would like to share a document while presenting. Just a second. I think it's uploading. Okay. Well, from ancient times to present day, humanity has faced different conflict typologies such as kingdom-based wars, invasion, liberation, revolution, religious, guerrilla, psychological, Cold War, and etc. According to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, the solution of the disagreements between the people are possible either through politics or war. Although I think the politics is defined as a dialogue-based action seeking for compromise, it is obvious that many conflicts are extension of politics. And throughout antiquity, the use of the violence by the ruling or power classes to implement their own policies has led to the conflict. Whatever the cause, conflict is a form of intervention of a place in every sense, because any kind of conflict causes the act of seizing, destroying, and rebuilding the place. Throughout the history, I think place has always been a political plane, and occupying someone else's territory and someone else's place has considered to be one of the greatest indicators of power. Individuals in society have their own places, and the relationship between people's places and places owned by the power is one of the factors that determine the state of conflict. As being an architect and community resilience activist, was born in a conflict zone, Cyprus, a divided island surrounded by other conflict zones in the region. I witnessed my whole life how power mechanisms try to impose their authoritarian structure within a place. Kant defines the state of war as lawlessness, With this in mind, peace can be defined as creating a living environment with unity and harmony that is protected by national and international legal codes, where the role of state is inevitable actually for peacemaking. However, the comprehensive process of trying to remedy the underlying causes of a conflict is peace building, not peacemaking. And here the role of the society is always more important than the state, as we all know. But the most challenging issue of peace building is to be able to produce a place where a peace system will be established and sustained. And my definition of urban peace building as an architect, and I hope it's not going to sound like shared space abstract, is to dissolve the conflict through mutual dialogue with an empathic language, and to design with people a balanced and integrated environment with nature. And urban peace building is not an easy task when you consider a country like Cyprus, which has been physically divided for more than 45 years. The fragmentation of the island in 1974 separated the social spaces from each other, and sense of belonging took a chaotic form throughout the island as individuals were detached from their own homes and neighborhoods. This makes a place a very, very sensitive issue to negotiate. At this point, I want to highlight that architecture is one of the instruments used to create a peace system, because architecture is an act of designing all living spaces for humans. Architecture has a unique potential to create, and if necessary, recreate collectively a peace infrastructure. And interestingly, from a small island to teach an urban peace building design studio at Pratt Institute, I was in New York City during the first 6 months of the COVID-19 outbreak. Starting from the January, news about the COVID-19 was on the agenda of the New York. In February, first cases followed the rapid spread of the virus. At the mid-March, life paused in the city due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That situation for sure sabotaged our peace building practices depending on face-to-face interactions. However, I believe it also made us to question our lives and our environments, because during history, crises have always acted as a catalyst to transforming the environment. Crisis reminds us nothing lasts forever and change is inevitable. And when you start questioning life, only then you can take first steps to change it. And I believe every change starts within a place. During the first months of the outbreak, countries all over the world started to close their borders to prevent the spread of the virus. This separation, access to health facilities or masks or sanitary materials following the economical turmoil for sure triggered the demands of different groups of the people. But I believe it also prompted peace actions as well. For example, in Cyprus, people reacted very, very harshly for closing the internal border. And first violent conflict with the police forces were experienced at the Nicosia border, since embodied practices of peace building have started at no man's land for some years. The people who come together at the Nicosia border, having different demographic characteristics, dance, sing, play games, and transformed the border space into a common place to express collective dreams for unification. Yet it became a kind of a shared space and not in an abstract form. People made this. However, governments use COVID-19 outbreak as an opportunity to keep people separated, which turned the situation before 2003 when the borders were still closed. But virtual spaces at this point offer us an organizational space to develop our constructive dialogue. And this partnership flowed from a virtual space to a physical one when the borders reopened in June 2021. The COVID-19 isolation and restrictions provided, I believe, similar experiences, not only at the contested, but other places in the world as well. And just like you listened before me, during my stay in New York City, this city was planned to be gradually open in June 2020. However, at the end of May, the city was shaken more severely than the pandemic by the wave of the protests that start with the demand for justice for those who lost their lives due to the color of their skins. From police abuse and racial injustice to pandemic-related unrest and beyond, many problems were accelerated by increasing polarization due to the crisis. But people reacted to all this, at least people reacted in New York City. Hannah Arendt, in her book, The Human Condition, argues that people can live without doing any work, but they cannot continue their lives without an action. And according to her, action is the condition of human existence in society. So to conclude, the way I see it, I believe COVID-19 pandemic reminded us the rights and responsibilities as the citizens, not citizens of states or cities or states, but earth citizens, such as rights for living, access to food, clean air, clean water, health rights, which are both the parameters of the peaceful living and ecological living. We need to form peace infrastructure in the cities more than ever. And perhaps this pandemic might be one of the loudest wake-up call for this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ceren, for sharing your thoughts. I want to switch next to Lior Lehrs. Lior is a research fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a postdoctoral fellow at NYU in New York City and a visiting scholar at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. His research topics include theory and history of conflicts, peace and diplomacy, and he works on various conflict areas such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, and the Balkans. Lior, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. And first of all, I must say that I'm really glad for this opportunity, and I really want to thank all the speakers for participating in this panel, and to thank Danny for chairing this important discussion. So I think I will focus in my remarks on Jerusalem as a case study, and I would like to start with a general comment about urban peace building, urban peacemaking, that actually going in the lines with what Scott was referring to. And then I would like to say a few words about COVID in Jerusalem and COVID in contested city. So first, I can say when we are talking about urban peacemaking and what exactly, how do we see that? One of the events that I really remember all the time that was a discussion that I participated a few years ago when we presented a proposal or research of an Israeli-Palestinian Track 2 project that was suggesting the idea of a peace agreement in Jerusalem that would be based on the concept of open city, that there will be two capitals in Jerusalem, Israel and Palestinian, but the city will be open, there will be no physical separation. And there are many experts in the room from the field. And I remember that during this discussion, it became very clear that there is suddenly a division of this group into two very clear camps. When the first camp was mainly people from Jerusalem or that expertise is about Jerusalem, that they are talking about this proposal, about this idea only from the Jerusalem perspective, talking about the main problem, the challenges of the resident, talking about the free movement between the sides, when the people work, when the people are buying their food, and talking about the importance of different dynamic and processes that are going on in the city between East and West Jerusalem. And the second camp were mainly people from expertise is not about Jerusalem, it's about the peace process, it's about security, it's about diplomacy, and they're looking for what Scott talked about, the national perspective, the state-centric perspective. And they always use the term, the big picture. They talked about the two-state solution, to talk about how much we need to have a border and about security consideration. And I especially remember that there was one former general that was talking in this discussion, and at some point he was really angry. And I remember that he said, I'm not going to change the border of my country in a peace agreement just because there is a Palestinian guy from Surbacher, for example, that is working in a shopping mall in West Jerusalem. Why we need to change everything just because he can find a new place to work, they can find a new place to study. And I remember that it really struck me, the illustration on this context that we just mentioned, the clash between the urban perspective and the national state-centric perspective of what it means to do peace and to do peace in a city like Jerusalem. And now if I'm moving to COVID, I would like to share some thoughts and insights from a study research I did at the first year of the pandemic that was looking on disaster diplomacy and was looking on the influence of disaster in general, but more specifically COVID-19, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and what we can learn from that. And I was looking on different areas, and I would like to share some thoughts about what was different between Jerusalem and other areas in the conflict. When some of them are positive, some are more negative. Today, negative and positive, it's the opposite, but going to different direction. So on the one side, one aspect that I thought was very critical is the issue of no man's land. Also, Ceren mentioned that. And this is something we have in Jerusalem. It's the area beyond the fence, beyond the barrier, that actually have no effective control, not Israeli and not Palestinian. We have that also in Mitrovica, maybe Irvine can talk about it in Kosovo, we have it in Belfast, we have it in many areas. And I think that during a disaster and during pandemic, this is a very critical issue. And who will take care of these people when you have this vacuum? And the question is that it also can lead to a lot of friction and tension between different actors that will try to take care of that. And we saw that at the beginning of the crisis in these areas of Kafr Aqab and Shafat. Another issue that was different between Jerusalem, for example, from Gaza and from Ramallah, was that in Gaza and in Ramallah, you have Palestinian forces, you have Palestinian police, that they will take care of enforcing some COVID regulation, COVID rules in the area of the Palestinian neighborhood, the Palestinian cities. But in Jerusalem, you actually need that the Israeli police, the Israeli security forces to do that. And I remember that I was thinking about, because we know how much this question is sensitive. We saw that even just in the Jewish side, the tension and sometimes the violence between Israeli policemen and the ultra-Orthodox, the Jewish religious neighborhood when during the COVID-19. So I was wondering when I did the interviews in Jerusalem, how come we don't see that clash also in East Jerusalem, the Palestinian side? The main answer I received was that the police is not there. The police is staying away from the neighborhood. They are not trying to force this regulation during the COVID. Even if a Palestinian will call them and they will complain on some big weddings during the first wave, they will not do anything. And this is, I think, a classic question for contested city. On the one hand, if we will send the Israeli security forces to these places, immediately it can lead to clashes, it will lead to violence, it can lead to a wider escalation. On the other hand, nobody else is doing that. You have a vacuum, nobody else is taking care of this issue, and this is part of the problem during a pandemic. But when we are looking on the other hand, I think that when we are talking about contagious pandemic, as opposed to maybe other problem or disasters, it's very clear for the authorities that they must take care of the problem in East Jerusalem or other areas, because eventually it will affect immediately the other side of the city. We are talking about the same space, people are moving, you have daily contact between Israel and Palestine in East Jerusalem. It's different from the situation between Israel and Gaza, for example. So it was very clear for the Israeli authority and the municipality from the beginning that they cannot ignore, if there are maybe, we can see neglection and many other issues, but this issue you need to address even in the areas beyond the fence. And I can say maybe the last point, that something that I found very interesting and this during my study was how the urban context and how the local context in Jerusalem was much more comfortable for the creation of a lot of interesting cooperation and channels of coordination between different actors that usually do not talk with each other, they do not recognize each other, but it's much easier to do that when you have a local context. Again, different from Israel and Gaza. Israel and Gaza want to coordinate during a pandemic, they need international actors, they need other actors. In a city, even if there was a Palestinian, at the beginning of COVID, they created a Palestinian civil society organization, very impressive, that created 82 organizations. They call it the Jerusalem Assembly Against COVID. And they, of course, said we are not going to work with the Israeli authorities. And of course, also the Israeli authorities will not work with them because they don't have any status. But what was very interesting to see, and I learned it from the interviews I did, how they started quietly to agree on many interesting arrangements, especially the first and the second wave. I will just mention one example. For example, this organization created the first quarantine hotel in East Jerusalem. Nobody else did that. They were the first one who created that. And of course, Israel will never recognize that because it was created by a Palestinian organization that have no connection. But suddenly, after a few channels that was true, by the way, activists in civil society in Jerusalem that have a lot of networks, they have a lot of reputation that they build over the years, and they have brokers that can talk between different parties in the municipality and the police and with these activists in East Jerusalem. Eventually, Israel actually recognized this quarantine hotel and started to send people in East Jerusalem to go to this hotel without formal recognition. Another interesting case that I saw in this secret communication was about funeral. During the first wave, there was a lot of concern in East Jerusalem that if in a funeral, the police will send forces in order, again, to enforce regulation that was taking part during this case, it will immediately lead to chaos, it will lead to violence between the people and the police. But of course, the police must do that according to the rules, but they quietly agreed between some Palestinian activists, civil society, and the police through, again, different secret channels, that they will stay away for the funerals, and there will be a Palestinian medical organization that will actually take care of the funeral, and they will do it instead of them. And we saw that during the pandemic, there was some cover or maybe excuse that maybe we can be more flexible. We don't need to go according to our formal policy, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, and maybe we can be more flexible and agree on a few steps. There was even a dramatic gesture at some point of the mayor to decide to stop the house demolition in East Jerusalem during the first wave. And this is maybe one of the most sensitive issues in East Jerusalem, but that was a very specific gesture at some point. On the other hand, and that will be my last word, the main conclusion I found in my study in Jerusalem in other cases was that eventually this cooperation, this coordination was limited in scope and in time. Eventually it was temporary. Over time, everybody got used to COVID, the conflict came back. And we all know that in 2021, we saw, of course, East Jerusalem is going to another circle of violence, escalation and violence that we saw in April and May 2021. So actually all of this positive sign that we saw maybe at the first and the second wave slowly disappeared.
Thank you very much, Lior. I turn now to Ivan Gusic, who's a researcher at Malmö University, associate research fellow at the Swedish Institution for International Affairs, and visiting scholar at the University of Pristina. Ivan is interested in and has published on the overlapping topics of ethno-national conflict, peace building, post-war cities, urban violence, and peace theory. Ivan is currently involved in two research projects, one which focuses on urban peace building, and the other which maps and explains conflict-related violence in post-war cities. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I have just two caveats before I start. One is that I'm an extreme morning person. I don't function that well after 5 in the evening. So if I'm incoherent a little bit, that's why. And the other caveat is that I'm talking about urban peace from an article I've been writing. And after being on review for 1 year, I got the comments this morning, and it's like, it was a revise or resubmit, which is the best you can hope for, but it was some punches in the stomach. So I've had some difficulties focusing on this because I was a little bit angry at the reviewer. So apologies for that. I've been listening here and to the very people before me, and I've sort of I think adapted a little bit here. I think so. I think before we start talking about what urban peace is, I think we sort of have to think about what we mean with peace, and then without the prefix of urban, and then sort of try to locate urban peace in this sort of how should I say, in this discussion. So for me, peace is basically a socio-political order according which any given society is either organized according to or is envisioned to be organized according to. So for instance, we can have, everyone's familiar with the liberal peace, there's Marxist peace, there's if you're going to go religion, you can go Hindu peace or, you know, Islamic peace, or where I am at the moment, we have Serbian idea of peace and we have an Albanian idea of peace. So basically how I see the peace is that it's not really as it often has been thought, and I think also like in the public it's thought like this is some form of universal objective and given concept that we all agree on, and you know, and that it's the transition from war to peace is linear, you know, and technical. We just need to sort of implement peace. But I rather see peace as sort of a very plural, subjective and contested concept, which we sort of have very little agreement over, meaning that the transition from war to peace is necessarily, you know, both non-linear, but also very political and contested. Which means that sort of in the post-war period or in a post-war city, for instance, we would have always different groups who engage in conflicts over peace, which for me is, you know, conflicts over how to organize this post-war society, or in this case, how to organize this post-war city. Here, I would not place urban peace, because for me, urban peace is not, it's not a way of, you know, organizing the city. It's not a way of creating a form of peace vis-a-vis other pieces. Rather, for me, urban peace is what I've, in another article, calling a theoretization towards coexistence between pieces. And the whole idea is just because we have sort of different ideas of peace and because we have conflicts over peace, this doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, we must have at the end of the transition from war to peace, that we must have one dominant piece, you know, that singles out or, you know, negates all the others. I feel that while there are some ideas of peace that are completely erratic, you know, they're so different that, you know, the existence of one piece means the eradication of the other. Just, you know, for the Israeli context, for instance, it will be, you know, the Israeli ultra-right piece vis-a-vis the Hamas piece, you know, how they envision or, you know, ordering these two societies, you know, these two can't coexist. The one will destroy the other. But between these sort of extremes, I very much believe that, you know, there is room for compromise, there is room for, you know, coexistence between different pieces and different antagonists who advance these ideas. And theoretizations towards coexistence between pieces are, you know, theoretical constructs that try to envision how we can reach this coexistence. A very famous example is hybrid peace, which is based on the whole idea that, you know, we create coexistence by pieces by, you know, fostering a hybridity between them where they sort of become, where we create a socio-political order where we have, that consists of ideas from different pieces and therefore becomes acceptable to more antagonists than previous, because everyone can see something in their piece, in the socio-political order from their piece. Agonistic piece is another one, but here it doesn't really try to merge different pieces, but it sort of tries to create mutually accepted institutions that are open to disagreement, meaning that conflicts over peace can sort of be transformed there and continue in these institutions, because, you know, how we're going to order society is sort of open for debate, and therefore conflicts over peace can take place non-violently rather than violently. And it is sort of in this category or this group I would place sort of urban peace as giving the city a potential to sort of foster coexistence between many different ideas of what peace is, and therefore between many different idea, you know, antagonists who advance these different ideas. And I believe the city does that through sort of three quite distinct but also overlapping dynamics. One is sort of what I call urban creativity, which is sort of, we all know this idea that, cities are, places of experiment, melting pots where people and groups and ideas come together, and then new things are formed, new relationships, new ideologies, etc. And here, my idea is, that urban creativity, in the context of post-war cities and peace, can make different antagonists exit their comfort zones and sort of start talking with each other and create, sort of come together and create shared pieces, where, they see that they have many things in common and then formulate sort of new ideas together. Dan, how am I with time?
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. I didn't, bloody hell. Okay, I'll speed this up.
But you can take a few more. We have time.
Okay,
and
then
everybody actually, most people took more than their share.
Okay,
so
well
that's
then
fine.
I'm going to be like most people. I'm going to skip the empirical examples. But to be frank, not all pieces that are different are so compatible, that they can be combined. There are, different ideas that are in many ways incompatible. And when meeting each other in the city, for instance, they are not going to say, oh, let's have a new piece together, but they're going to stay apart from each other. But here, I would say, here comes, another dynamic, which is urban accommodation, because the city and the nature of city life sort of demands of people in the city to either cooperate pragmatically with each other over shared problems, for instance, or just ignore each other, because you can't really go into conflict with everyone in the city, everyone you dislike, because there's so many things, there's so many people, you can't engage everyone. In the city, you sort of have to ignore most people around you and sort of just have like a co-presence with them, the way you just ignore them. And here I would say, the city offers yet another way in which pieces can coexist together, and that is by sort of pragmatically cooperating with each other when needed, but otherwise just staying away from each other. I would say, Belfast city center, I can come into that later. Belfast city center is an example of that, where, outside of the center, different groups fight over each other, and, but in the city center, it's like, oh, here we're fine, we just ignore each other. We don't talk about the conflict in the city center. But then again, not everyone, or not all pieces are so willing to accommodate each other. There are pieces that, upon meeting each other, would go into polemic with each other. And here is a third sort of dynamic that I see that the city can foster coexistence through, and that is urban fragmentation, because people and groups, we don't live in cities as a whole, but the city consists of a million small little worlds where people physically are quite close to one another, but socially they have no interaction whatsoever. And here, this sort of fragmentation in different ways, this is not a very positive idea of peace, I admit that, but this sort of fragmentation allows different pieces that don't want to be with each other, to be separate from each other, don't have much interaction, but still coexist in the same city. And for me, for instance, Mitrovica is, while quite problematic, one example of such, where you have Serbs in the north, Albanians in the south, not cooperating that much, but still they coexist in the same city. So I would say, to conclude, I would say, that urban peace is sort of an idea of how cities can generate coexistence between antagonists who think differently about peace. And I'll stop here because I haven't done any empirical research during the COVID, so I don't really know what I would say. So I just focused on the first one. I hope that's okay.
That's fine. Thank you, Ivan, very much. And now, last but not least, I want to introduce Noam Brenner, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science at the Institute of Regional and Urban Studies in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In the last years, Noam studied the community leadership in Jerusalem, in the Palestinian and in the Israeli neighborhoods in the city. Noam also co-managed a peace-building initiative in Jerusalem and now serves as a community manager, actually an elected position in the kibbutz where he lives. What Noam's going to do is going to address urban peace building in times of pandemic from a community perspective. Thank you, Noam.
Okay, thank you, Danny, and of course, thank all the speakers before me for your insightful comments. Yeah, I'm going to take a bit more community and practical perspective about urban peace building and how I see the concepts of urban peace and urban peace building. And in the last 3 years, from 2017 2020, I was a part of a management team who led a peace building initiative in Jerusalem. And we thought that we are doing peace building. We didn't knew that we are doing an urban peace building. We are not sure that we even used this concept or this theory. But in the most simplest sense, what we do was to integrate the urban and peace building. So what exactly do I mean? So as Ivan said before me, when we are talking about peace or peace building in this sense, what is happening in these kinds of projects or initiatives is that they are an organized and planned processes. They are aimed to, in general, positively transform the relations between two groups inside the city or in general outside of city. And urban peace building initiatives, I'm not talking about urban peace building in general, just initiatives, okay? They are doing the same thing, but they are core in the urban setting. And this definition broadened their aims. So now it's not only about relational transformation, making, bettering the attitudes of one group versus the other. It's also have a much more locally driven goals, like community empowerment, physical improvement, leadership buildings, and all kinds of other urban development processes. So what we did in our initiative, in our project, is we tried to, the name of the project was building a common vision for Jerusalem. So we tried to create shared narrative for Palestinians and Israelis together, something like, we are Jerusalemites. And we try to do it around urban issues, like what do you think about safety in the city, education in the city, or infrastructure in the city? And this is something quite important and I think and unique about urban peace building. It's taking the urban, integrating urban problem, urban issues into the idea, into the prospect of, also bringing people together and contacting people, and also creating a shared narrative about the city and not about the conflict. And urban peace building, in that sense, it's quite the same, but it's not limited in time and organized and planned like a small initiative which take 1 year or 2 years. What I want to argue, and I was thinking about it in the last few days before this this panel, is that mainly urban peace building, it's a process that in the city that it's never end, because in the state level, people from different communities and different groups, in some cases, they don't even have the chance to meet each other. So they are talking about the other group. They don't even speak their language. In some cases, they didn't even met someone from the other group. But in cities, they have to meet the other side, and they're meeting them all the time at the public transportation, workplace, universities, or whatever. So it's something that happens, and it's a never-ending process that is connected to the daily life of the resident, of the city residents. And yeah, as I said before, as simple as it is, it's integrate, intergroup relations with urban aspects all the time. And in our project, this is exactly what people were talking about. So they, in some sense, it's very positively to say that it's really happened, but they went out of their own, national group and talked about who they are as Jerusalemites and how they can, make their city a better place. But also when I interview community leaders during my PhD, I heard the same ideas. And when I asked them about, what is your visions for the city, they also talked about something different than the conflict. They were talking about, we want Jerusalem to be a more tolerant city, a multicultural city. They wanted to be maybe a religious city. They had all kinds of ideas that, when they talked about the city, not the state, they were able to speak in a much more sharing position with the other group. And this idea of a shared narrative, it's also something that happened, I think, in times of crisis, and especially in the time of the COVID, because what happened to all of us during crisis, we are immediately entering a shared narrative, because all of us suffer from the crisis, earthquake, snowstorm, or of course, pandemic, and everyone is, suffering from the same problem. Our roads are blocked. We can't get out of our home. Maybe our houses collapses and building collapses, and all kinds of tragedies are happening all the time. And it also happened in the COVID. And in times of crisis, what we usually do, and I have to say, this is in many cases what the state are telling us to do, is first of all, we are taking care of ourselves. Everyone is, just trying to see that everything is okay. Later, we try to take care of our families, and then our communities, the city, and the states. And this is like a fundamental thing about the crisis. That's something surprisingly happened. It's changed our entire life. And in the city, it's happening, it's disturbing our entire daily lives. And there's a big mess. And everyone is trying to, to make small order in his life. And then, moving forward to influence maybe a larger circles in his life, as I said before, family, community, city, and maybe the states. And when you're trying to do something that is bigger than, your own family and your own community, it's create a lot of opportunities for cooperation, as maybe you even need the cooperation of the other community in the city. And we saw it in the COVID. Lior gave very good examples of what happened in East Jerusalem, for example, during the pandemic. But yeah, we saw a lot of Israeli authorities entering East Jerusalem, creating a checkpoint for tests, vaccinating people. But it didn't happen in the beginning. In the beginning, there was a lot of effort, on the Israeli side for Israelis, on the Palestinian side, in the Palestinians for them. And it took a bit of time when Israeli got, the permission or the legitimacy to enter into East Jerusalem. And many of it was because of the state of each community, and also former connections and actors inside these communities that helped, Israeli to gain the legitimacy to enter East Jerusalem. Lior mentioned earlier, the idea of, it's not an idea, it's the brokers inside the communities, the community leaders, and most of the work done by Israel is in East Jerusalem was through the community councils, schools, and people who already were engaged in some connection with Israel, and also got really strong legitimacy from their own community. So they were able to, to create this bridge and this channel to help, to let Israel help the Palestinian side of Jerusalem. But I have to say, it's not, in most cases in crisis, the advantage group is helping the disadvantaged group, but it's not always like this. There is a really nice example in 2014, there was a big snowstorm in Jerusalem, and the first neighborhoods that got organized and cleared the roads from the snow was the neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. And when they finished clearing their own roads, they were recruited to help on the west side. So there is also a balance in this in terms of the crisis, and but in many cases they are dependent mostly on the advantage group. In the COVID, I think that there was something quite interesting because there was a lot of locally. All of us started, to especially during the lockdown, there was a lack of direct contact in the city. People didn't get out of their homes. They had to put masks. They didn't talk with each other. They were isolated in their home, in their groups. And there was, I have to say, some dissolution of the communities and especially of intergroup cooperation. So, but this was mainly in the start of each lockdown, and also in the start, I think, of the first wave and maybe the second wave. But later on, we saw that the crisis was an opportunity for cooperation between the two sides. So going back to the idea of urban peace building as a process, and I'm going to conclude with that, is that urban peace building, I think, and in many ways, it's a process that never ends, and people are living in the conflict, within the conflict, but also within a process of peace building, because they're all the time inside city, of course. The conflict is so salient that they are all the time feeling the other side, meeting it. So there is all the time a tension between, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And in many cases, this integration between the urban and intergroup relation, urban aspects and intergroup relations, it's not always understood by the people who are, from one side, trying to do peace in the city. They, in many cases, ignore the urban aspects or ignore the urban, development processes. But also the municipality, in many cases, that are trying to develop the city, they don't all the time think about peace issues. So if they are, making, deciding about different policies about the city, they're not always thinking about what it's going to do in terms of intergroup relations. So urban peace building, it could be, what we did in 3 years, something very limited in time with very concrete goals, but it also can be a process that concerns daily life of each resident in the city. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much. And here we conclude the first round of comments. This is the opportunity to open up the floor for any comments that the audience want to have for what was said here, or if people would like to share their thoughts about peace settlements, arrangements in cities, and so on. And then we're gonna also have a second round with the presenters who want to address that. If you have questions, comments, raise your hand and the floor is yours. If you're too timid, I'm willing to share my comments.
Danny.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. I have two separate questions.
Just introduce yourself first.
Yes, my name is Nir Barak. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Politics and Government at Ben Gurion University. I also do urban politics and political theory, and I have two separate questions. The first goes to Professor Scott Bollens, and he's mentioning of a polarization in the US and how we might start seeing this type of a need for urban peace building within American cities. Now, without underestimating this polarization of a multicultural left and, I don't know, a white supremacist on the white, and the Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd, don't you think that questions of nationalism make a difference in the type of urban dynamic or urban peace building dynamic required? I mean, after all, there is a shared history of living together that has been quite solid for decades and more. And isn't this to some extent underestimating what the challenge of peace building in national conflicts is supposed to achieve? That's the first question. Should I hold the second, Danny?
Do you have the question for a different person?
The second is for the panel.
So why don't you also present the second question, and then
the second question is cities as peace builders, not only in their internal dynamic in conflicted cities like Nicosia, Jerusalem, Belfast, etc. But I would like to hear your thoughts about the potential for cities to cross borders where states do not cooperate. I mean, this comes from my interest in urban autonomy, municipal autonomy, and how cities are creating their own political spaces. And do you think it would be possible to think about cities as peacemakers, either between conflicted countries, Haifa and Beirut, for example, or within countries that do have peace agreements, but it's a cold peace, Beersheba and Amman, for example, Tel Aviv and Cairo, that type of dynamic. And I will add that I have a PhD student who is starting to work on this topic, Kim Noach, who is here with us.
Hi, Kim.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the second question.
Okay.
And of course, thank you very much for all the 5 talks. Fascinating, eye-opening. Thank you very much.
I'll go ahead and start since the first question was directed at me. I think if I understand your question is that the US, or put in my own words, the US will never get to the level of polarization we see in Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, et cetera, because there's an overarching nationalism, a shared history in the US that will not fragment compared to contested societies where there's competing nationalisms. Is that a fair paraphrase of your question? I want to get it right first.
I would say it's a different type of fragmentation, and that, a fragmentation based on political opinions or racial status, ethnic backgrounds, etc., might be different from national fragmentations.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, we don't have the competing nationalisms in the United States, based on different interpretations of history and events in the past. There's not that differing nationalisms. However, what you're seeing on each of the groups is the creation of their own history of the United States. And that's where things get a little troubling. The white nationalists, if I can group them together, allude a lot to a history of white America, of the greatness of white America and how it's been polluted and stained by immigration and multiculturalism. So the white nationalists are reinterpreting history or interpreting history in a way that certainly advantages their view. And now the white nationalists are you know, they feel aggrieved. They feel they're losing their country. And at that point, it kind of resembles the differing histories of competing nationalisms in polarized societies. And if the white nationalist group continues with this and solidifies this kind of interpretation of history, we're getting these two you know, fundamentally different perspectives on what America was, what America should be in the future. The president before Biden constantly referred to make America great again. And that was a constant coded message to make America great the way it was. The coded message was that when political positions were held mainly by white Americans and they were doing great things for white America. So, you know, it's rhetoric in terms and it's vocabulary being used and the coded messages. And it starts to resemble the real nationalistic conflicts that occur in contested societies throughout the world, where there are competing views of history and there's views of winners and losers. So the white nationalists are kind of, you know, they're playing that game. They're using that us versus them dynamic, and it's increasing in intensification. It's not lessening. And social media is playing a fundamental role, this unregulated social media. The white nationalist group, I think I'm talking too long now, the white nationalist group, their most extreme is the QAnon conspiracy. And when you talk to a QAnon conspiracy believer, which I don't really recommend you do, but when you do, they will constantly at the end of that conversation tell me, do the research. And they feel that they have facts and evidence on their side to support their very warped view of what's going on in America. So at that point, we get into that, you know, situation of polarized societies where the two sides can't talk to each other. They yell at each other and there's no listening. There's no possibility of drawing from that shared history that is America, although increasingly contested. So.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Any reactions to Nir's second question? Yes, Ivan.
Yes, I just have actually a follow-up in support of Scott, and then I'll answer the other one. Yeah, I definitely agree with Scott. You know that there are different ideas of history, you know, vis-a-vis nationalists, white nationalists, and others in the U.S. But I also think, like, from a peace scholar point, I think we should be very wary of, you know, thinking that, you know, wars are only happen, you know, across ethnic or ethno-nationalist lines. Sure, they have been doing primarily so in the last couple of decades, but you know, there still are ideological conflicts, etc. So just because in the States that you don't have polarization over nationalism doesn't mean that you can have polarization over, you know, political ideologies that would, you know, then you know, develop into war. So I think, you know, we shouldn't think about the war and potentiality of war as, you know, being tied to nationalism only, just even if it is primarily today. On the sort of cross-border question of cities, I'm doing this in my project now where I would definitely say that there is very much a potential for cities, you know, to across borders or, you know, interact across, you know, a cold peace agreement between different states, but also within a city, within one sort of fractured state. symbolize some form of different ways of existing together, of coexistence. For instance, I would, Belfast in Northern Ireland could become, if it would become, a place where people live together, then it could be a symbol to the rest of Northern Ireland, etc. So I definitely, in terms of city autonomy, I definitely think that cities can do that based on, what I know about urban theory. In practice, though, I don't really see any city doing that, because they tend to be, in these conflicts I study, they tend to be the most entrenched in terms of conflict. But the potential, I would agree, is definitely there. It's just not realized.
Okay, thank you. Any more reactions? Yes, Ceren.
I don't know what's your standpoint or what's your argument, but if I understood correctly, cities as peace builders and peacemakers is absolutely possible, because each city has a personality. It has a genealogy, sense of place. And for example, think about Prague. Prague has never experienced war. Even the Hitler didn't let any attack to the city because it was super beautiful in terms of the architecture. But at the same time, some places have, it's a kind of a spiritual bond with the people, which is place attachment. And for example, in Famagusta, we have an area which is one of the third quarter of the city. It is abandoned by its original inhabitants, Greek Cypriots, and it kept for the bargaining chip for 45 years as a ghost town. Everything was over there, and people are still hoping to return back over there. And it was become one of the biggest problems in Cyprus. Actually, every kind of place is a big problem in Cyprus because of the relocations, displacement, resettlements in somebody else's houses and neighborhoods, etc., etc. But Famagustians, we came together and we started the Famagusta Eco-City project. And we said that right now we have the climate crisis, and the climate crisis can be overwhelmed with the cooperation of the cities and all the variables which can come together. And we said that we can provide people an umbrella concept, which nobody will argue, because whatever you say, for example, when you talk about city planning, people get, thrills like, but somebody else wants something, somebody else wants to have big hotels on the beach line, some people want parks. It becomes all the conflicts because there is a benefit, of the different corporations, there is the benefit of the people. But when you're talking about the ecological aspects, nobody, how can I say, reacts to them, because they are realities, especially on an island when the resources are very limited. So the cities should share this, and some cities are providing them. So the Famagusta Eco-City project become a kind of a, how can I say, a vision, a common vision of the people, which brought all the Famagustians, the former and current, who abandoned the city. And for example, myself, I was born in the city after the fragmentation of the island. So I'm a new generation of the Famagustian. My father is originally from another city, actually. If there wasn't a fragmentation of the island, I wouldn't born in Famagusta. So I think, yes, especially to fight with the climate crisis, when you consider people's different attachment to the place is a very important concept. Place is our extension of our existence. And I cannot think of any more powerful tool than the cities to build the peace. I don't know if this is actually what you're seeking for, but as an architect, that's how I see and respond to this.
Okay. Yes, Lior.
Just a few years ago, when I did the research on the open city, and I was looking at the idea of binational cities and different cities that you have an international border in the middle. And I started, of course, with the cities that you mentioned, of course, like Nicosia and Berlin in the past. But then I was moving actually to different contexts, like European places that you have divided villages and divided cities that used to be divided because since the First World War or Second World War. But over time, the border became open. And then there were very interesting development, even though we are talking about very different contexts, not Israel, Palestine, Kosovo, Serbia. We're talking about, for example, Sweden and Finland. There was the Haparanda Tornio. It's a very interesting case that it's a city that was divided over the years, and they lived for many, many years as two separate cities in two border cities. But after the border was open, and we're talking about, again, Sweden and Finland, they actually decided to create this own one city and to have one council and to have one center of the city. And for example, to have joint infrastructure, to have joint For example, if there is an emergency, they don't want to send someone from the capital, they can send someone from the other side of the city. And of course, we're talking about a very different context, but I was trying to learn from this case what it would look like, in a very far future of doing a binational city. And the interesting thing is that they also created their own local identity. And they also said that the center don't care about us. The capital don't care about us. We are both in the border of the city, in the a small village in the border. So let's fight together. Let's find a way together. And also a way to attract tourists, because the European Union are very glad on this kind of cooperation, because this is a symbol for the new European Union. But that was a very interesting thing. But I think that also in Nicosia, we can see this cooperation about sewage that was going on, even when there's still conflict going on, even when there's still a division, you still can cooperate on the level of the urban to find some common goal, to have something that will be good for both sides. So maybe looking on the more positive side.
Yes, Noam.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting, I think, question. And first of all, I think it's hard for me to imagine that cities will, negotiate peace, over the head of the state. But I think, first of all, that as Ceren said, cities have their own ethos, they have their own identity, they can be a symbol or an example for peace, for tolerance, for human rights, for a lot of things, and then they can set an example for other cities and maybe create a more soft cooperations between states. But of course, cities can be sites of peace. Well, this is what we are talking about in here, and especially divided or contested cities where two nationalities are living in the same geographical place. But here again, we know how sensitive it is when municipalities are trying, to take a stance and to encourage peace. Even in Jerusalem, we have the Ministry of Jerusalem Affairs. Just if any mayor would try to do anything, so the government still have some say about it. But what is interesting, and it's related to what Lior said, to your example, is cities and regions that are right next to borders. Here, I think that there is a chance for regions and maybe even cities to be more independent and create some interaction with the other side. We see it in the Arava, in the south of Israel. There's a lot of cooperation between Jordan and Israel. There isn't some cooperation in my next to the kibbutz where I live. It's also right next to Jordan. So here the region have some also incentive to create cooperation with the other side in all sort of issues, which again come back to the idea of not exactly an urban peace building, but something like a regional peace building, which concern a lot of daily life issues, not sewage as happened in Nicosia, but again, tourism. Now there's a lot of things about renewable energy that is happening between the two sides, agriculture and this kind of stuff. So there is a potential, but maybe when they have a proximity and they have they can tell a shared narrative between the regions, the city, and across borders. So this is mine.
Yes, Scott.
I think the Nicosia case is a really interesting one here. We're talking about urban autonomy and the related question of can an urban peace precede or encourage a national peace? And I'm speaking here of the openings in the wall that's occurred since the early 2000s. And I know there's problems with the mobility, there's restricted mobility. And I know there's problems with pre-division ownership on each side of the island. So I'm not going to call that urban peace, but it's at least in Nicosia a move towards some sort of urban normalization. And the question that I've always had in my mind with that in the last few years is, to what extent over time, and maybe I can prompt our Cypriot colleague on this, to what extent over time does that normalization partial normalization of Nicosia, will that encourage over time the chances for a national agreement between the two sides? Or is what's happening at the urban level just totally separate from the national agreement, which will always stay in stalemate? So can urban normalization push us closer to getting at national peace?
If I may add to this just a second, because it's actually something that I wanted to ask. It's that I also ask you, because you raised the idea of the national piece versus the urban piece. So it's the issue of sequencing, right? This is what we're talking about. What should come first? Can in that regard. So I mean, I'm also very curious about your thoughts about this.
Yeah, despite what I just said, because that scenario I just presented about Nicosia would be an exception. I don't think urban peace can precede national peace. I say like an urban peace without a national accord would tend to be fragile and could possibly be even counterproductive. It could set off local conflicts that will intensify at the national level. But on the other hand, I think a national peace has to come first, but a national peace without an urban component to it is going to be unanchored in the realities of day-to-day life for people living in these cities. And in that way, a national peace without effective urban implementation may not be sustainable, because it'll become increasingly abstract over time to people. So I think the national peace agreement is absolutely necessary, but I would argue it's not sufficient.
But in a sense, you can create realities in which you can ease the transition by acts like breaking the wall in Nicosia, or little small projects that are big enough to matter, or things like that can ease the transition of in the implementation at the local level.
Yeah, I think national peace agreements should incorporate urban guidelines much more than they do. National peace agreements tend to stay away from that. They're good at allocating political power, but when they start thinking about the microgeographies of cities, they just kind of freeze, the negotiators do. I think we have to, the national agreements have to get beyond the kind of abstract goals of shared space, coexistence, and get into more specific guidelines about what that actually means, especially in the major capital city, which is so symbolic. Right. It sounds hard, and it's not what national negotiators do, but it can be done, especially if before the national agreement or as a part of it, there are urban teams working on these on-the-ground guidelines, track 2 diplomacy, if you will, that have established what the principles of urban peace would be like in the capital city. And if that's going on at the same time or preceding a national agreement, that could be put into the national agreement as an appendix or what have you, but it's there. And then it can lead to much more concrete actions at the urban level. New projects that benefit both sides, and all of a sudden people see, okay, I see the national peace. It's right in front of me now. It's making a difference in my life, in my workplace. It's making a difference in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ceren, you wanted to react also, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few words. I think Cyprus is an exceptional case in many levels. First of all, we have guarantor states, which is a chaotic formation. There's United Kingdom, Turkey, and Greece. The second thing is there's relocation and resettlement of the people, but that is a very rare situation in different areas of the world. For example, myself, I grew up in an abandoned Greek Cypriot house, which was given to my family as an equivalent property, what they left in the southern territory of the Cyprus, and their belongings were everywhere, and generations changed. That had been decades, the people who were claiming on the idea of they're going to return back to their land, their territory, their homes are now disappearing and dissolving. For example, my grandmother never called the place which I called home, because her home was in the south, but she passed away even they opened the borders in 2003, and they opened the borders many years later. And another problem is we are an island, and most of the cities supposed to operate together, and the division is dividing the cities with each other, and it's dividing the capital. And when they open the border, these operations become possible. For people, for example, I had friends from the southern side. I couldn't see them in my own country. We could meet in UK, in United States, but never in our own country. But now the city, the Nicosia, start operating together, especially the walled city, because the walled city is directly separated. And there's a one major street. Now people can cross very easily, and you can experience the entire city, and that any kind of other developments. You have in the buffer zone some meetings where everybody are welcome. You don't have to show visas or whatever. It's a place for everyone. Yeah, that's triggered the process of peace building. But I think things are super complicated still, because we have this bottom to top where the community wants, because community are happy to be together, artists are together, the peace builders, activists, ecologists, they're all together. But on the other part, we have diplomats, we have other states, and you always see the man in streets, no female, no woman, no architects, just the politicians negotiating something that are not very transparent to us. Yes, Nicosia's when this borders open, the operation on both sides definitely brought us closer. Things are very complicated in Cyprus, because we don't know what the other actors wants from the island. We have so many bases. We have British sovereign areas. We have other bases. It's really complicated. I think you know it better than I am. As a peace scientist, I'm just an architect, and I am interested in the place, because in Cyprus, whatever, for example, in a land to do an architectural project, it's my nightmare, because you don't know who owned the lands originally. And if you are building on a Greek Cypriot land, is it ethical? Or it has been 45 years, some agreements are done. Is it ethical or non-ethical? It's very complicated. But yes, it's bringing closer to the peace for sure, because we see each other and we cooperate with each other. We share the same city, at least.
If you don't mind, I want to, if I can just add a couple of comments, or actually a couple of questions. One already Scott addressed, but I would like to actually ask Ceren and Ivan, because you both gave examples. Ivan, you mentioned Mitrovice as a place that has that sort of equilibrium between two communities that coexist, but nothing more than that. And on the other hand, Ceren, you talk about the civil society in Famagusta making changes and fighting climate change, etc., etc. So I wanted to ask you about the agency of the city, or city government, maybe along the lines of what Nir was referring to. He was talking about autonomy of the cities as a sphere separate from the state for one moment. So how does the city government play in facilitating, empowering this type of initiatives in the case of Famagusta, or where exactly it plays in maintaining sort of a livable coexistence in Mitrovice? And obviously, what can we learn from that about the role of cities and city governments in these processes of urban peace building? I'm going to finish all my comments because they are related in a way. So this goes to Lior's comment about the city of Jerusalem playing a key role in the pandemic, but in a way, you can say, well, that what the pandemic did in that regard, or the agency of the city as a city, the mayor, was to crystallize the asymmetric relations between East and West. So I mean, and now it's a done deal. The East is totally dependent on the West of the city, and that's all. So one could say, oh, okay, so look at this, such a nice cooperation between East and West. But another could say, okay, we put an exclamation mark to the occupation, and it's a done deal. So, and the last comment goes to Noam, which I'm a bit familiar with the project he described. So you find one of the things that you cannot avoid is the thought that the only way to do urban peace building of the type that you described is actually by avoiding the conflict. Because if you want to touch on the conflict, you cannot do the project. So you have to avoid the conflict in order to do something else, some sort of urban peace building. So those are my comments in that regard, and I really appreciate any thoughts that you have on this. Ceren, you want to go first? Go.
Yeah, very simply, I want to summarize them because these are really complicated situations. In Famagusta, we have the Famagustians who has always been there, like the Turkish Cypriot community, which they were inhabiting in a particular place. There was an old city, walled city, and they were over there. And there's this Varosha issue, which was abandoned by the Greek Cypriot community. And the understanding of the Famagusta for the former inhabitants, the Greek Cypriots, are only the part outside of the walled city. But for the Turkish Cypriots, the former Turkish Cypriots, it's only inside of the walled city. And for me, it is everywhere except the Greek Cypriots abandoned area. So first of all, the city at the beginning for both sides were different, and both communities are electing their own mayors. Although the Greek Cypriots abandoned their city, they have their different mayors. So we have two local authorities which are not in cooperation. One of them actually had no access to the city. Now they opened the Varosha for, touristic facilities. You can go and see what is left there. Anyway, so when we were just making this Famagusta Eco-City project at the beginning, like an umbrella concept, we told the mayors, we spoke with the Turkish Cypriot and Greek Cypriot mayors, and we told them, okay, here we are making to unify the city together with the ecological principles and not to have another divided city. For example, if the Varosha is returned someday and Greek Cypriots resettle there, but they said we're going to keep the border closed, just like in Nicosia, we have to, abandon such things, and we have to make a cooperation together and just forget a minute who's going to rule the city, because that was another problem. Everybody said, let's open the Varosha, the barbed wires and everything. But now who's going to govern the city? Because we basically have two cities. We said that, okay, forget about this for a second. And we told the mayors that, how can you support us? And they said that as long as it's not political, we can provide anything. For example, are you going to make a presentation about the coastal erosion? Yeah, we can give you a space, but we cannot cross each other's boundaries. For example, the Turkish Cypriot mayor never and ever went to the Greek Cypriot mayor's municipality building. One is located in the south, one is located in the north, and there's a border in between, for example. But both of them gave us a place to tell us about our ideas, because we convinced them that with this pollution, with this lack of energy, we are having power cuts. We used to have a very limited water. Thankfully, for 3 days it's raining, but you never know. And there is a pipes coming from Turkey, which another problem. They're not very reliable. So we were just convincing that ecology is our most critical and important issue right now. And you have to really cooperate together, because if there's no place, there will be no one to govern it. We have to forget about this dominance, and we have to find a way to cooperate together. I think that's what brought everybody together. And the local authorities cooperate to some extent, but like a shadow exchange, they were supporting, but in a shadow exchange. So it's a very long story. I want to keep it short and here to give others, because I think we're running time.
Yeah.
I hope this explains the situation a little bit.
Thank you very much.
Can I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
About the autonomy, the division I spoke about, that sort of a divided or fragmented piece, it's sort of a result of more national level divisions, and they are quite satisfied with that, but also local people. At the moment, there is absolutely no agency whatsoever in the north. whatsoever. There's a direct line between the president in Serbia and the mayor in the north part of the city, and the mayor will never do anything that the president hasn't explicitly told him. A couple of years back, when I don't know if you remember or know about the barricades that were erected in 2011 and on, then it was a different kind of thing, because then you had a sort of very right-wing parties controlling the Serbian part of the city, and then you had a sort of center-left president, and then they had a lot of agency and did a lot of not only protests against KFOR and the Kosovar government, but also their own. But then when the new president came in, he sort of cleansed everything, and that now they have absolutely nothing. It's a direct line. The South is a little bit more dependent, but it depends a little bit of, you know, who's the mayor and which party the mayor comes from, and if that party differs from the government party at the moment. It does now, so it has a little bit of agency, but I would say, you know, the division that's there is basically sort of a frozen conflict that everyone's sort of okay with, and that comes, you know, it comes from that.
Okay. Thank you. Lior, Noam, quick comments, and we're reaching the end of our session. Yes, Noam, go ahead.
So, Danny, I hear your comment, and Danny was part of the management team of the project, and you know, there's different styles of peace building initiatives, and some you know, go for the coexistence or confrontation or storytelling, but what we tried to do was you know, the idea of a shared project, creating something together and creating a shared narrative, and I think that urban peace building it's an opportunity to create something which is, you know, a shared narrative, which is not definitely or directly related to the conflict. This is an opportunity. It can happen also. Now I think it's happening around the issue of environment or the climate crisis, and it's happened also during, I think, the crisis of the COVID. But it's true, and it's related to what Scott said, that if the urban peace building precedes the national peace building, so you will always do it under the conflict, under inequality, under the idea that, you know, in Jerusalem, for example, the residents are under occupation. So there is a lot of tension when you're trying to do something which is quite even artificial, you know, creating this kind of shared narrative. And we saw it, we saw it. Most of the Palestinian partners that we have said, don't use the word peace, don't use the word shared, don't use the word common, don't use the word anything that, you know, that relate to doing.
Right. Or future for that matter, right?
Yeah. But I'm trying to, you know, to stay optimistic and to think about cities as a site of peace and site that can, you know, think differently from the state. So, thank you.
Lior?
Yeah, so maybe just briefly, I think of the question of normalizing the status quo, normalizing the occupation. I think it's the main question, the main dilemma when we are talking about local peace and daily peace. I can just mention that now we have this project between Davis and Mitvim that we are dealing with local actors, how they can promote peace. It can be health organization, environmental organization, different kinds of actors. And I think I read all these papers, and all the time that was my main question. Okay, they are doing a very nice project. They are changing exactly what we call everyday peace. They can improve contact, they improve a lot of things on the ground. But on the other hand, they are not changing the status quo in any way. They are not leading us to a peace agreement. They are not changing as you said, the asymmetrical, the inequality situation. And I think this is always the dilemma in this question, and it's difficult because it's something that we need to balance. I think that Nicosia, it's different because you have both sides control themselves. You have the Turkish side, you have the Greek side in Jerusalem. The Israeli side also control the Palestinians. So it's more difficult to talk about normalization when we are talking about this cooperation.
Okay. Scott, any last thoughts?
Something that's always stuck with me through the years is a statement someone once made that says, war is easy, peace takes time. and especially urban peace, where you're dealing with what Mehran Benvenisti used to call intimate enemies.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you very much for the participants, for the audience, for this very thought-provoking and interesting panel. I hope you also feel it was thought-provoking and interesting, and it's not just my impression. And have a great day, I guess, in the United States, evening in these parts of the world, and I will see each other in other conferences. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Good
Thank
night.
you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.